to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review. Today I'm talking with Gokul Sahni, who wrote The Main Drivers of Soviet Foreign Policy Toward India from 1955 to 1991, which was published in Volume 8, Issue 1 of TNSR. Gokul, welcome to Horns of a Dilemma.
Thank you so much. And I do have to say it's a real honor. I've been hearing Horns of a Dilemma for a few years now. So the fact that I'm honored to get to speak is a pretty huge deal for me. So thank you. Thank you so much.
Well, wonderful. Thank you for listening and thank you for joining us today. So for those who have not yet read your article or who need a refresher, can you summarize what some of your key arguments were?
Sure. So my essay is called The Main Drivers of Soviet Foreign Policy Towards India from 1955 to 1991. I pick up in 1955 because that's really when the Soviet-India relationship comes alive. That's when Khrushchev and the other Soviet leadership make their celebrated visit to India. And that's really the start of it. And I go on until the disintegration of the Soviet Union in 1991. So what I do over these various decades is that I look at three key factors that I believe end up driving Soviet foreign policy towards India. The first is the spread of communism as a domestic political ideology. The second is, of course, the unfolding Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States across the world. And the third is the Sino-Soviet relationship about the regional order for Asia. What my research basically does is it shows that all three drivers were important in their own way, but the importance often waxed and waned with time. And it often depended on who was in power in Moscow. So what I've also done is I've divided the essay into the three eras, first of Nikita Khrushchev until 1964, then Leonid Brezhnev until 1982, and of course in 1985, Gorbachev comes into power all the way until 1991. Very quickly, to talk about ideology, while India was never communist and never had a communist party ruling it at the center, it was socialist. And especially under India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, there was a sort of appreciation that capitalism, especially unfettered capitalism, was not the answer. Western hegemony was not something that India wanted. And there was therefore some level of ideological convergence between India and the Soviet Union. On the Soviet Union's part, they did hope that India would become socialist, at least in the 1950s when they were optimistic. But over the years, they understood that that was not going to happen, but they would still get some sort of mileage out of the relationship. For the Cold War, India was important to the Soviet Union, but not in a sort of traditional ally way. India was a very poor country when it became independent in 1947. It lacked material hard power. And so India's use to the Soviet Union was more in the sense of its own weight in the international arena, the fact that it was an important member of the non-aligned movement and the Commonwealth. And in a sense, the Soviet Union often wanted to have India on board because it often made sense to show the world that it was not just communist countries that listened to the Soviet Union or agreed with them, but they were also important other countries. And the final and the part that I feel has been most understudied in Western literature is the impact of the Sino-Soviet relationship on India. And that is because in the 1960s, after India lost a war to China in 1962, the Sino-Soviet split deepened. And especially under the Brezhnev era, Moscow looked towards New Delhi through this lens of the Sino-Soviet split. And for the next 2 decades, that is one of the key drivers that drove the relationship. Interestingly, though, towards the end of the Gorbachev era, the Soviet Union wanted a rapprochement with the PRC. And so it soon wanted India to start following its lead. And then once you come to the end of the relationship by 1991, all these three key drivers started to weaken. To summarize, there was a level of genuine warmth as well as ideological convergences, as well as strategic convergences in this relationship. But what I do want to leave listeners with is the idea that Moscow always looked towards New Delhi through the prism of its larger relationships or the more important relationships it had with the United States and with China. And it was always trying to see how it could best use India in both of these relationships.
Yeah, that was something that really struck me in the article was that the global nature of the Cold War, and in this case, the way that China played a significant role, perhaps not an entirely active one, but that India's concerns about China and the Soviet Union's concerns about China played a major role in shaping those relations between Moscow and New Delhi. And I wonder if you could maybe say a little bit more about that historically, and if you're willing, think a little bit about how that is playing out today. Is that still a major factor?
Absolutely, that makes sense. And just to talk about today, The reason why I looked at this topic was I've been explaining to Western friends that if you know Indian foreign policy, if you know India's history, you should not be surprised that India was not going to ditch Moscow over its invasion of Ukraine. And one of the senses that even till today in India, amongst the elites and the general public, there is a sense of gratitude towards what the Soviet Union did for India in the Cold War. Now, all that goodwill has accrued to the modern state of Russia, which you could argue perhaps isn't fully deserving of all that goodwill. But this history very much plays a part in modern relationships even today. So, on your specific question about China, let's start when India got independent in 1947 and China had its own revolution in 1949. At that time, the Indian government, led under Jawaharlal Nehru, really wanted to establish peace in Asia. It wanted good relations with China. It understood that both these countries have undergone colonization and they need to work together for the benefits of the millions of people. So in the mid 1950s, India and China signed the Panchsheel Five Principles of Peaceful Coexistence. But very soon, it then turns out that the border that both of them have inherited from the British Empire when it comes to India and from the Tibetan Empire when it comes to China, the border dispute is going to be a major problem. And so in 1959, there are skirmishes, and in 1962, there's a war. Now, this is very awkward for the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union, especially under Khrushchev, is wanting to create this sort of Asian bloc where, along with the Soviet Union, you have India and China. These are the three big continental players. And it always wanted India and China to get along. But very soon, when the skirmishes started, when the war happened, it was very clear it would not. The Soviet Union belatedly did back China. And it kind of had to, right? Because China was the communist brother, whereas India was just the non-communist friend. But there was a sense of disappointment in China that the Soviet Union was not unquestionably taking their side. And this played a small role in the Sino-Soviet split, but of course that had sort of bigger implications. But then in the mid-1960s, what the Soviet Union started realizing is that because they have their own problems with China, suddenly they look towards India and they say, well, you are the antagonistic neighbor to the south, we are the antagonistic neighbor to the north, let's try and work together on China. What is important to note is that India was very careful not to go along too far with the Soviet Union. And in 1969, one of the main items that I've mentioned in this essay is that the Soviets unveiled the Brezhnev Plan, which is the plan for collective security across Asia. And the Soviet Union really wanted India to sign up. And to Indira Gandhi's credit at the time, she did not, because she did not want to enter into a state of permanent enmity with China. So while the Soviet Union kept trying to push India against China during the 1960s and 1970s, India didn't fully come on board. And just as well, because in the 1980s, the Soviets changed their mind. Then they, undergo a rapprochement with the Chinese, with Deng Xiaoping. Then there's the peace offensive. And at that time in the mid-80s, they then tell the Indians, well, why don't you follow our lead and why don't you make peace with China? And there's this important story that happens in 1986, which is the 15th year anniversary of the 1971 friendship treaty signed between India and the Soviet Union, where the Soviets are very clear to say, well, this treaty is not directed against anyone, to make it clear that, the Chinese need to worry. And then when the Indians and the Chinese forces have a standoff in 1986 that lasts up to 1993, Gorbachev is asked at that time whether, he would back the Indians against the Chinese. And he's very non-committal about it at the time. So there's a sense that the same country that was telling India that it should join it in its battle against China, within 2 decades realizes that actually it wants to make peace with China, and now it would like India to come on board. There are parallels with the modern Russian state as well as India and China. We're all aware, especially after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that Russia and China have become extremely close. And that has made many in India uncomfortable. However, India has still managed to retain that Russia relationship, where it's trying to differentiate India's relationship with Russia as well as China. So what I would say is watch this space, because if Russia and China get closer and closer, it may eventually impact the India-Russia relationship. But at the same time, I think listeners should take away this fact that the India-Russia relationship is deep. It's been around for many decades, and it has survived through a lot of change. So, odds are that it would probably, continue to survive in the years to come.
That's really helpful background to understand some of those historical roots in terms of these relationships that still matter so much today. Also, in your article, you very interestingly go through some of the differences in the relationship, partly based on who was the leader in the Soviet Union at the time. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about the way that both those different leaders' prisms on the world, as well as shifting changes in geopolitics, changed the Soviet India relationship over time?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a great question because not only did all these three individuals have their own personalities, they were also dealing with a different set of circumstances at the time. Let me add one other bit to this. All three of them had an Indian counterpart, and just by coincidence, the Indian counterparts were from the same family. But let's start with Nikita Khrushchev, who's been described as being extremely optimistic about communism. In the 1950s, he was sure that communism would beat capitalism, which is something that, perhaps now with the benefit of hindsight, we would look back, almost laugh at. But, in 1957, when the Sputnik moment happens, when the Soviet Union is, pretty strong across the world, and the US is still a bit nervous about the time about the Cold War, it makes sense that Khrushchev was very, very optimistic. He had high regard for India, but I want to qualify that in two parts. The first part is when Khrushchev started his offensive towards India, it wasn't some great master plan that he had. He wanted to make friends with everybody. Even the visit that they did to India in 1955 was India, Burma, and Afghanistan. Right, so it's like if we will be in Southern and Western Asia, let's try and visit as many countries. India was not the only country in the 50s that got aid. Egypt got a lot of aid. Indonesia got a lot of aid. Now, it just so happened that the other relationships fell across along the way, and we can talk about that if you want. But the India relationship went on. But the second part is that Khrushchev did end up having some genuine affinity for India, where he thought that India should be a great power. And in some senses, he was decades ahead of his time. As we are moving towards a more multipolar world where India will eventually become a great power, Khrushchev saw that in the 1950s. And he spoke that why shouldn't India be a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council? There were talks about summits where India should also be invited. And mind you, India at the time was far from being an economic power. It was just a very large country, a very influential country on the world stage because of Jawaharlal Nehru and because of his own sort of personal prestige at the time. But the focus that Khrushchev had was communism is eventually going to win. India looks fairly decent from a socialist point of view. Let's back them. Nehru's the right sort of leader. With time, India will become the country that we want it to become. And of course, it's a major prize to show in front of the Americans that here we have India on our side. Obviously, the Sino-Soviet relationship was less important at that time. Khrushchev was still wanting to make them all get along. But having this global outlook, he found a very willing partner in Jawaharlal Nehru, who also had a very international outlook and who wanted India to talk about issues not just in the immediate neighborhood. So India was a major voice during the 1956 Suez crisis. India was talking about the Congo. India was talking about global sort of conversations for which, Khrushchev really enjoyed that India was often joining the Soviet Union in that. Now, all this changes in the Brezhnev era because Brezhnev himself was very different from Khrushchev. He was not so ideological in the sense that he cared less about the spread of communism. He cared more about making the Soviet Union into a traditional great power. They had the military buildup. So at that time, he looks at India and he starts asking for naval bases. He starts asking for more military cooperation. The military hardware that's sold increases at that time. His sense is more of using India for the Soviet Union's benefit. So, for example, the KGB in the Brezhnev era establishes one of its largest bases, perhaps the largest base in the non-communist world in India, where it becomes a major source for espionage and propaganda that's often used against the United States. By the Brezhnev era, it's also clear that India is not really going to become communist, but the Soviet Union doesn't mind so much at the time because remember, Mao's China at the time is also claiming to be very communist and they're claiming to be even more communist than the Soviets. So there's almost this feeling that, rather than influencing India's politics domestically, we rather ensure India's foreign policy is more to our liking. And then finally, when you move on to Gorbachev, you get, and just to come back to Brezhnev, his partner in India was Nehru's daughter, Indira Gandhi. Indira Gandhi was different from her father. She cared less about the international stage, more about the regional stage. She cared a lot more about India's hard power. Of course, the 1971 war happened under her. So both partners were good for each other in the fact that they took the relationship forward. When you then come to Mikhail Gorbachev, who comes to office in 1985, his partner is Rajiv Gandhi. Indira Gandhi gets assassinated in 1984, and her son reluctantly becomes India's prime minister. Both of them strike this unlikely sort of friendship And in the early 1980s, the Soviet-India relationship was kind of cooling down. India was looking towards the US to try and improve relations. The Soviet Union was looking more towards China to improve that. But once Gorbachev comes to office, he and Rajiv Gandhi are able to bring back some of that ideological spark. Suddenly, there are conversations again about denuclearization, disarmament, making the Indian Ocean a zone of peace. Gorbachev gets Rajiv Gandhi to say that Reagan's Star Wars is, this dangerous idea. So there's almost this uptick that happens in the end. And one interesting anecdote to share is that it's during Gorbachev's time in the late 80s that the Soviet Union agrees to lease a nuclear submarine to India, which was a big deal then. It's still a big deal now for a nuclear power state to give such a platform to a non-nuclear state. But by the end of the relationship, of course, Rajiv Gandhi exits office in 1989. Gorbachev gets more busy in the end of the Cold War. In 1989, gets distracted. By the end of the relationship, all the three drivers have kind of weakened. And this is one very interesting line that is there. That is that perhaps nowhere in the world was the loss of the Soviet Union bemoaned as much as in India. And that's a bit of a strange line because you would think that someone in the communist world would certainly miss the Soviet Union more. But actually, the case is that they would not because they were used to the Soviet Union dominating them in terms of the politics, in terms of the economics, in terms of telling them what to do. Whereas if you're India, you get a lot of benefits from being in the Soviet Union, but you still get to go on your own way and you do what you want. So when the relationship finally ends, because the Soviet Union disintegrates, India is left with the loss of its largest strategic partner, one of its most important economic partners. And then to bring it to the modern day, that coincides with the time where modern India is in economic difficulty and it undergoes the liberalization, privatization, deregulation that then kickstarts the Indian economy that we now see that's firing today.
I think that's so interesting looking at the way that there's different personalities on both the Soviet side and the Indian side were playing key roles in that relationship and the way that they have these pragmatic shared interests, but then they also have these identity interests that sometimes align and other times perhaps less so. I wonder, drawing on all of that, and I know that often historians don't want to draw too much to the present day, but I still wonder if there are useful lessons that we can draw that you see in the research that you've done on this historical relationship for geopolitics and India's role in the world today?
Again, good question to link it with the modern day. And I would say yes, because India and the Soviet Union showed that it was possible to have a good relationship outside the traditional Western alliance structure, right? Because for the US during the Cold War, it was pretty simple. If you want to become a US ally, guess what? You also have to become a free market liberal democracy. Now, more or less, it wouldn't necessarily start off like that, but eventually it would look like that. Now, there's, of course, nothing wrong with that. But I think what the example of the Soviet Union and the India relationship is that both countries don't have to agree on how they have to shape each other, but they can still see where they have convergences and work with each other. But more importantly, have an agree to disagree approach. And you can only really have an agree to disagree approach when you see each other as almost equals. I don't want to say that the Soviet Union looked towards India as an equal. I don't think it did. But it also did not look towards India as in a traditional client-patron relationship. It did not ever believe that because we offer some aid and because we offer some military supplies, we can tell the Indians what. That was a smart call because, frankly, India would not have listened to what they had to say. But it's an example, perhaps, for the modern US and India relationship because India is not going to become a traditional ally of the West like a Japan or a South Korea or a European state. There are going to be several sort of ways where the US and India can work together. But on differences, it's better to agree to disagree rather than convincing yourself that you can convince each other. I think that is very interesting that the Soviets ultimately were happy to let go of trying to spread communism in India. And they realized, let the Indians handle their own politics. Let us just try and worry about how we can use India in the international arena. I think, obviously, with the incoming Trump administration, everything may change. But there was a sense in the Biden administration, with the summit of democracies, that democracy promotion is something important from an American point of view. What I would say is this essay probably gives an example that perhaps countries like the US should worry less about democracy promotion. They should worry more about how they can get along with countries and maximize their interests. I'd also say that this relationship effectively between Russia and India that continues is along the same lines. And that is work together where you have convergences and agree to disagree politely without trying to make something too large about it. Obviously, both Moscow and Delhi are aware that they have different relations with Beijing. Now it's pretty simple for both sides to say, hey, you need to take my side, it's my side, or the other way. But both countries have realized that there's no point of letting go of this relationship just because they have a disagreement now. And what I would also say in geopolitics is that alignments change. Today, Russia and China are friends. There was a time they were not. There could be a time in the future when they're not. Does it make sense for India to give up on this relationship just because at this moment, Russia and China are good friends? So I think that's one lesson that we can get.
Is there anything else you would like to add before we wrap up? And also, is there anything you'd like to say about any future work you may have coming up that listeners might be interested in?
I think one story that I'd like to mention is that it's interesting to compare the Soviet-India relationship with two other countries in particular, Egypt and Indonesia. Because in the late 1950s, the Soviets ended up having the same playbook. They do arms deals, they give aid, but for different reasons. In the case of Indonesia, 1965, there's a military coup. Sukarno is ousted, Suharto comes to power, who's more anti-communist, and that entire relationship just goes away. So the Soviet investment, is just practically over, and Indonesia and the Soviet Union's relations never recovered to that level. In the case of Egypt, one could argue they did even more for Egypt than they did for India. They, were ready to back Egypt during the Arab-Israeli wars. In 1970, you had Soviet pilots who were flying Egyptian jets during the War of Attrition. And interestingly, in 1971, just before India signed the Treaty of Friendship, so did Egypt. But in 1972, things go wrong between Egypt and the Soviet Union. Anwar Sadat expels all Soviet troops. And in a few years later, in 1976, the Egyptian parliament abrogates the friendship treaty with the Soviet Union. So in 1977, when the Indian government changes, for the first time the Indian National Congress is voted out and the opposition comes to power, the Soviets immediately send their foreign minister, Gromyko, to India because they want to make sure that they don't have another repeat. So by the time you come to the late 70s, the early 80s, the Soviet Union just wants to maintain its relationship with India just so that it can show the world that it can have these friends. And I think that's something interesting, that if you invest long enough in a relationship, suddenly it has a life of its own. A bit how, for example, US relations with several democracies around the world are. It can then outlive personalities because it is then sort of institutional. It is tied to a country's history, to its overall strategy. So I think that's something that's interesting. In terms of further work, if I want to be ambitious, perhaps there could be a book project here. I also think that a book on overall Soviet-India relations would be useful. I mean, when I was trying to look for one, I couldn't really find it. But perhaps the most sort of realistic next step from here is one of the main writers who I've quoted in this is Professor Wojciech Masny, who wrote a great piece in 2010 about the Soviet Union's partnership with India. And I reached out to him and I shared this with him. And he said, why don't you take this one step further? And why don't you look at modern Russia's foreign policy towards India from 1992 up to today and look at what drives that? And that's sounding pretty interesting to me.
That's great. I would personally love to read that. That sounds really interesting. Well, thank you so much, Gokul, for coming on Horns of Dilemma and sharing your research and your insights into also what we can draw from those historical lessons for today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. Do not forget to read the Texas National Security Review, which you can find at tnsr.org.